Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name's Adam and I try to make you a little bit better at English every single video. This is the second video in my Power and Conflict Poetry GCSE anthology set, so we're going to dive straight in. And last week we were looking at Ozymandias. Today we're going to be looking and checking off London. If you haven't seen my Ozymandias video, go check that out. And today's going to be looking at London. Now also, if you haven't seen my get started kind of guide on poetry, the way that I recommend looking at poetry is by looking at it through this acronym called CART wars. Okay, so we can establish the CART, or the first half, based on the wars, or the second half. Now the way I'm going to be teaching most of these poems is going to be telling you the CART first, because obviously I've done these poems a million times. But if there's a poem you haven't seen before and you're trying to analyze it, start with the words, the language, the rhythm, rhyme, the structure, and that will start to tell you more about what the poem is about, the themes in the poem, the tone of the poem, all that good stuff. Okay, so London, we'll start by reading it. This is by William Blake. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights the plague with plagues the marriage hearse. Okay, wow, so this is a very dark poem. It is a Victorian poem written by William Blake, who was also what was called a romantic poet. Now, I'm not saying romantic like love poetry. There was a movement called Romanticism, and the romantic poets were often poets that were very heavily criticizing the way that society was going in basically the Industrial Revolution and post-Industrial Revolution era of England. They felt that we were ignoring nature and neglecting nature and nurturing and emotion, and instead focusing on man-made objects, right? Stuff that people make, and logic and science and rationality, but in an unbalanced way. And they definitely had a point, because obviously London in the 1800s was a place filled with fog and smog, which is a smoke fog, and soot and pollution, and it was not a very pleasant place to live. And remember, we're talking about the capital of the British Empire at this time, right, in the 1800s. So you would think the pinnacle of the biggest empire of the time, and yet it's not a nice place to live. It's a place full of darkness and pollution and corruption and misery, right? So that's what William Blake is kind of getting at in terms of what this poem is about. It's sort of highlighting all of the decay that he saw in London, the London of his time. And he points to a few different places where he thinks the corruption is happening, and he maybe hints at ways that he thinks things could be improved, including the fact that he was very pro-French Revolution. Okay, he wanted to have what we might call an English Revolution or a British Revolution, having seen our cousins in France, dragging the kings and queens and what we call the aristocracy, right, the upper class, out of their palaces into the streets, and many of them having their heads cut off with the guillotine, right? So he had pretty strong views, William Blake, for his time. So the poem is set with Blake wandering through the chartered streets of London. Now, the word chartered means kind of measured or recorded, and so he repeats this word chartered, chartered. The repetition is meant to emphasize the fact that he feels that London has been completely bought and completely recorded and measured, and everything throughout London is like absolutely rigidly like written down who owns what, and it's all very black and white, and he doesn't like that. Remember that only a couple of hundred years prior to this poem being written, there was barely any recordings of who owned what land. There was what was called common land, so there would be peasants that could sort of build this land for free and kind of live on that land, raise, cattle and livestock and grow fruits and vegetables and things on that land to sustain themselves. And then there were huge reforms that got rid of that, made all land privately owned. All of these peasants were sort of kicked off of that land and made to go elsewhere. And it was a real pain for those people. Where could they go, right? And that was another big driver of what we would call urbanization, because these people that were kicked off of the land that they had been dwelling on didn't know where to go. So many of them went into London or other city centres to try and find work. And obviously there was lots of work, even if it was really bad work, in factories at that time, even though the conditions were awful in most cases. And so this has led him, as he's walking through London. Oh, and I want to say one other thing as well, just quickly, in terms of the rhythm and rhyme. There's a very clear sense of rhythm and rhyme in the poem. So we have, I wandered through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. So you can hear as you're reading the poem this rhythm to the words, right? And there's also an AB, what we call an alternate rhyme scheme as well. And I think that Blake does both of these things, the heavy rhythm and the alternate rhyme, to create a sense of the walking, right? Left, right, walking through the streets at night, left, right. So I think that the rhythm and rhyme adds to that idea that he's walking through London, yeah? But this isn't a good thing. We have another bit of repetition. I mark in this context is I notice or I see, I mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe, yeah? So the first mark is to observe or to see. The second two marks, the mark of weakness and the mark of woe, I think are meant to be either literal marks or symbolism, marks of pain on the faces of the people he's seeing as he walks the streets of London. You've also got the soft phonology or the soft alliteration of weakness and woe. The W sound is very soft, and so this creates almost a sense of defeat, that these people have kind of almost been defeated and they're just depressed and hurt and just trying to exist in London at this point. This doesn't seem like the capital of a great wealthy empire. It seems more like a hellscape, not somewhere that you'd want to live. Now that message is then emphasized even more in the second stanza. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every van. So we have this insane level of repetition, every, right? 5 times. And it's all filled with really negative descriptions, negative imagery, negative verb choices, right? Crying is repeated, the cry of men, the cry of infants, the ban, the fear. So everything that he's seeing in London is fear and pain. And that is just one of the major themes in the poem, actually, is just pain and suffering and fear, okay? And then he finishes this second stanza with a really interesting idea. He uses this metaphor of the mind-forged manacle. So something that is forged in the mind, obviously, is something that is mental or psychological, right? Not a physical manacle. And by the way, a manacle is like a shackle or handcuffs or something like that. So it's this idea that the pain they're going through and the struggling, it starts in their minds. The fact that they are defeated mentally, defeated emotionally by their lives. It weakens them physically and it makes them sort of slaves, really, or enslaved or servants, oppressed to the upper class and the business owners of the factories and all of the superiors, right? Now, the reason that this is quite interesting is because this is his call, in many ways, for what we might consider an English revolution similar to the French, right? The French took over from, the French working class took over from the aristocracy. And he's basically saying that England could do the same if they could just change their mindset and stop allowing the upper class to oppress them. Obviously, no English revolution ended up happening in the end, for better or worse, but that is really what he's calling for here. He's saying all of your suffering, all of your pain, it starts in your mind, and the fact that you're not willing to fight or change your life, basically. He then starts to go into some quite important images that are symbolic of the suffering. So he starts with the chimney sweeper. Now, the chimney sweep is perhaps one of the most iconic kind of Victorian images of a working class person, right? Often they were children and they would be sent up the chimney. The reason they were children often is because obviously chimneys are quite small, right? And they'd go up with a sweep, right? With their sort of sweep and be sweeping out all of the soot and dirt. Many of them died really within, just a year or two because of all of the terrible stuff they were inhaling. Imagine it's like smoking times a million, right? Just inhaling soot and dirt and dust and ash. But that is being used as a real symbol of London as a whole. This idea that these people in London were just, whether they were chimney sweeps or not, were just being covered in pollution and darkness, and the sky would have just been filled with grey smog and fog all the time, and smoke coming out of all of these chimney pipes from all these factories all over London, right? And it was affecting other institutions as well. So the church blackening is important in two ways. It could be, first of all, that the actual church buildings of London were being darkened with the soot and the smog and all of this dirt falling on the bricks and the exterior of the building. So a physical blackening, right? But I think it's also meant to be another symbol here of the kind of darkening of the church, the fact that the church wasn't sort of helping the people, the fact that the church was maybe becoming more corrupt through this period of time, things like that as well. So this is a very important thing. The work is terrible. An institution like the church, which maybe people would have turned to normally, wasn't helping them and was dark as well, really. And also there were still wars going on as part of the British Empire and British civilization. So the many soldiers are also out sighing, dying, and their blood is running down the palace walls. Now, I want you to notice that that's a symbol, but it's also juxtaposition, because what's implied by that image is you've got the palace walls, which are, relatively safe and housing the kings and queens and lords and ladies. And then you've got all of the blood of the soldiers that are fighting in these wars to maintain the empire, maintain British civilization of the time, right? And they're dying out there. So the walls are being covered in their blood symbolically. It's the palace that is creating all of the war and conflict. And so do you see how in this poem it's both power and conflict? The powerful London is actually full of decay and rot, but it's conflicts and wars that are maintaining the power within the palace walls of the people, of the kings and queens. And again, can you see how this poem is meant to make us feel kind of angry at the people in the palace? And that again is maybe stirring up wanting something like the French Revolution to happen, okay? A couple more points here at the end, just to wrap up this video. So as he's been walking, it's been getting darker and darker, more and more into the night time, right? And so now he's calling them the midnight streets. Now, I don't know if it's literally meant to be midnight or whether he's just saying it's later at night now, as he's been walking through London for several hours or whatever. But now what he's seeing is another form of decay, which is maybe there's been a breakdown of individual people because the work is really bad. There's been a breakdown of the church. There's been a breakdown of the armies upholding the palace, right? But there's also a kind of now a moral decay, which I think might be even worse. So as he's walking through these midnight streets, he hears youthful harlots cursing. Now, a harlot is a prostitute. And these are young prostitutes. He doesn't say how young these young people are, but let's assume that they're, 18, 19, very young, maybe even younger than that, sadly, right? And they're cursing through London looking for the next client, right? The next person to sell their body to. And there's then also an image of the newborn infant crying. Now, this may be a subtle reference to the fact that at that time, there wasn't very good birth control. There basically wasn't birth control, right? So many of these prostitutes would be having children due to what they were doing, but they weren't then looking after the babies. These babies were either being kind of left on the sides of the roads while they worked and did their work, or even worse, in some cases, these babies would have been what's called ditch delivered. And ditch delivery was basically when a prostitute gave birth and just threw their baby in the bin, right? That would be the worst case scenario. Some of them would have, given the babies to a church or a charity or some kind of community to raise up. By the way, many of these children were being born into terrible circumstances, right? So that's already a really bad start to life. Some of them would be just killed immediately. Others maybe would be orphaned. Others maybe are kind of neglected. And then as they get older, they're probably brought into that same business or other criminal businesses like pickpocketing or whatever. And if that isn't already a terrible enough kind of, set of images, the work that these harlots are doing is also a blight, or a blight is a disease, right? That plagues marriage as well. And the word hearse is usually used for funerals. So this is an interesting oxymoron. It's this idea that the disease of prostitution is actually causing the death of marriage. Now, to make that a bit more simplistic for you or straightforward, many of the upper class men were having these either secret relationships or these affairs with the prostitutes of the streets of London, right? Some of them would cause these unwanted children that I've just been talking about. But also imagine if the wives had found out what the husbands had been doing, that would obviously potentially end the marriage as well, right? We're talking about 1800s patriarchal society here. So it's not like these women, if they found out that their husbands were cheating, could easily find a job at that time, right? They had pretty much two options: a really bad job in a factory, which many people would rather die than do that, or a life of prostitution themselves. So do you see how it could create a negative cycle? Prostitution is a disease or a blight that is ruining marriages, causing unwanted pregnancies and unwanted children. That is one problem in society. Also breaking up healthy marriages, causing splits, causing divisions, possibly causing more prostitution, as women that are broken up with or divorced don't have anywhere to go or any support system. So you can see this is all, a negative spiral downwards towards chaos. So it's a very pessimistic poem. I'm going to finish by just saying one other bit of context. William Blake wrote this anthology of poems called Innocence and Experience. The innocent poems were much more light-hearted and positive in nature. The experience poems were much more pessimistic and terrible. For every poem in the innocent section, there would have been a poem that was a parallel to it in the experience section. The only poem where that isn't true is in this poem, London. This poem, London, is in the experience section of his poetry anthology, but he didn't have an answer to it in his innocent section. So that maybe adds one final layer, even more so, of pessimism to the poem. The fact that he doesn't have a silver lining or a positive side to this story. It's just negative and dark and gloomy in his eyes. And I think really, as I said towards the beginning, in his mind, the only major way that he felt we could resolve the problems of London would have been through civil war. And of course, that didn't happen. I hope that that was helpful. If you have enjoyed this video, please do, keep watching this series, share it with someone else that you think that could benefit from this. And I'll see you in the next one.